Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Emma Lieber, a writer and psychoanalyst in formation in New York. Yeah, so what do you want to start talking about? There's so many things going on.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think about what we could talk about, and I was thinking that I really wanted to talk to you about writing.
The writing cure.
Yeah, the writing cure.
Please talk about it. I really wanted to ask you about it.
Well, at some point in my formation, it was probably a couple of years ago, I started realizing that I had just a major question about writing and what writing and psychoanalysis have to do with each other and what it means to write as an analyst, and started realizing that this was a question that was really important for me and that there was something that I really had to work out around it, that it was both really important for me to write as an analyst and to transmit something of psychoanalysis and what psychoanalysis does and what it is through writing, but also that I kind of had no idea what it meant to write as a psychoanalyst. And I have kind of considered myself a writer for a really long time. And I had, I started out, before I trained as an analyst, I started out in a literature department. I did a PhD in literature and taught for a really long time. And in the academic milieu, you're always writing, and that's sort of expected, and you kind of know what your position is as a writer. It's somehow known in a way that writing is something that you do. It's a way of furthering your career. It's a way of furthering the field, that you're producing scholarship. And there were sort of all sorts of things about the process of writing that from that position I sort of had never questioned. Sort of what it means to write, who your addressee is, what are the sort of transferences involved in writing, what's at stake when you write, and where are you in the scene, sort of all of these. I don't know, for me at least, I think it's not necessarily the case for all academics, but for me, all of these questions were really occluded when I was writing as an academic, and sort of all of a sudden a few years ago, all of these questions emerged about how to position myself as a writer, and also as an analyst. And it was something that was very troubling, and it seemed like something that I really had to work out. And then a couple of years ago, I was reading a lot of texts that have sort of come to be called auto theory. It's kind of a sort of movement. I think the person that most people know who write in this way is like Maggie Nelson, who wrote The Argonauts several years ago. And these texts that are, both kind of deal in high critical theory, but are also very personal and are sort of have elements of memoir sort of interwoven with, really serious sort of theoretical writing. And it was really in reading those and reading her and reading Chris Kraus and other writers sort of that vein that I finally saw what voice I wanted to assume or felt that I could assume as a psychoanalytic writer. And a kind of a new kind of writing position sort of opened up for me, which was very much a kind of personal, it feels complicated because as you sort of go on in your formation as an analyst to sort of take a public face as an analyst, it becomes increasingly complicated to write personally. And yet it also became increasingly important for me to do so. So that's what I've come to, but it's still a big question for me.
And I love in the beginning of your book how you talk about how you were going to write a different book, but that this is the book that ended up needing to be written first.
Right.
What was that like?
Well, I spent many years kind of ambivalently trying to turn my dissertation into a book, and my dissertation had really just been purely on literature. And and I had a huge amount invested in that project, and I think I sort of knew, I kind of always knew that project, which was mostly on Dostoevsky, who was my sort of what I focused on in my PhD program, that it really was a personal endeavor. Like, it really very much was a passion project and a way of sort of self-exploration. And but that wasn't avowed. There was no way of saying that, either in my dissertation or in whatever book I was going to turn that into. And I think there was some way in which I needed to be able to sort of make manifest what the stakes were for me in order to be able to write. And within the confines of that project, I just couldn't do it. So I kind of labored ambivalently on that project for a very long time, before I finally got to a point where I said, I have to put this down. I obviously need to be able to take on a different position as a writer in order to really produce something that I feel invested in. And it was actually very scary, because it was, this was a project that had tethered me for a really long time, and I really had no idea what it was that I wanted to write, but I felt very kind of urgently that something had to be written, sort of both for the progress of my own analysis and also for my formation as an analyst. So the moment of putting away that first book, and sort of entering the abyss of this unknown where something is going to be written, but I really have no idea what it is, and kind of waiting for that, was, it was very exciting. It was very scary, actually.
And how did you get into psychoanalysis in the first place?
I think it was kind of always there for me. My parents were sort of a generation and of a kind of, they were Jews in New York in the 50s and 60s, and I think psychoanalysis was sort of in the discourse in a way in my family, and I think there was kind of a certain amount of transference onto psychoanalysis already. Like something about psychoanalysis, that it was interesting, that like Freud was interesting, but I didn't quite know why. And then I didn't really read any of it seriously until college. And in college, I actually took a class on Lacan first. It was one of the first classes I took in college, and I was absolutely terrified and didn't understand any of it, and didn't think I would ever understand any of it, but it presented itself as something to be pursued. But I was quite afraid. And then I took a few Freud courses in college, and I then wrote a senior thesis on psychoanalysis and literature. So I think there was something, I was already in a literature department, and there was something that I wanted to work through about, in what ways are psychoanalysis and literature kind of related discourses, or how can we sort of speak about them together. And then at the end of college, it sort of became a question of what, am I going to really pursue being an analyst at this point, or am I going to go do a literature PhD program? And I think to a certain extent, I ended up doing a literature PhD, and I think there was something about literature that I had to work out first, sort of. But I think that I also even then had some sense that I probably would end up going into psychoanalytic training eventually, but that training in literature, that a literature PhD was sort of already a good form of training to be an analyst. That was something that I kind of needed to pass through. And I think I also thought I wasn't ready at that stage. I think I wanted to have more experience. I wanted to teach, and I wanted to write and read in this other venue first. Or I was just kind of deferring things symptomatically, which might also be the case.
Both. Same thing, fills both functions. Exactly. All functions. No, but we had you're of course in Rendering Unconscious, the book, which we will talk about, but we had the launch party for the book here in Stockholm on Friday, And we ended up talking a lot about that, how like psychoanalysis has really survived through the humanities, through literature departments, film theory departments, but it's really not in psychology departments overall anymore. And that's one of the reasons why I think, training people outside of clinical degrees, lay analysts, if you will, or whatever you want to call it, is really important, because a lot of people with literature PhDs know a lot more about psychoanalysis than people with MDs.
No, I mean, in the department that I was in, I was in a Russian department, and psychoanalysis isn't in Russian departments. It's not taught all that much. But certainly when I was taking classes in comp-lit departments, it was there. And it's been heartening for me. I teach at the New School. I teach in the literary studies department there, and only recently have I'm teaching a course on psychoanalysis and literature there now, and I'll do so again, I think, next year. And there's a huge amount of interest, actually. I mean, at least in the courses that I'm teaching, like there's really a lot of transference onto psychoanalysis and onto analysts in a way that it's actually very encouraging. It wasn't quite what I expected. But it does make you think that it's not dying. Like it's certainly alive and well, and it is being that this is and it started to seem to me that this is a very important place to transmit psychoanalysis, is in the academy and the humanities.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about that too. That you can't kill psychoanalysis since you can't get rid of the unconscious. And, it might have been displaced from its original place of being in kind of psychiatry, psychology, but it survives and thrives nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to talk about your pieces for the book? I love them.
Oh.
One is related to Chris Kraus.
Right. That I think I had read, I forget when it was, I had read I Love Dick, and it opened up like a huge, I mean, I think a lot of readers feel this way about that book. Have you read I Love Dick? Yeah. And then I had watched the show, which actually is, people are very divided, I think, on whether they like the show, because Jill Soloway did one season of a remake of I Love Dick.
I have not seen the show.
Well, I liked it a lot. I really did. I thought it sort of captured the spirit of the book in a way that worked, and and it was, I think, also at this moment where I was sort of trying to figure out how to position myself as a writer, and there was something about letter writing specifically that I felt really compelling. And that book, I forget actually when it was published. It was maybe in the 90s or something. It was a while ago. But it's all written. It's basically love letters to a man that the writer hardly knows at all, but he becomes sort of an object of desire and fascination for her, and really a device in order to allow her to write. That's kind of his actual function, is something that makes her write. And there's something about that sort of that position of address that's both embodied and absolutely exceeds what the object is in the life of the writer that I found really, really, really compelling. And so, and it's a book, and then the show takes this on in ways that I found really interesting. That's very much about the ways that writing travels and the ways that writing sort of makes something travel. So the ways in which you are as a reader are made to create, made to write, made to sing, made to act, made to, do anything by what you're receiving, by what you're reading, or, what you're the audience of. And so I felt something of reading that book and watching the show made me feel very, very compelled to write. So I ended up sitting down and writing a series of letters to Chris Kraus and to Jill Soloway, the person who made the television show, that were just mostly about my responses to the book and the show. But it was very, it felt kind of like an ethical imperative in a way, that these were pieces of art that asked for a response, that asked to travel in a certain way, that really asked to replicate themselves. And it was I think writing that, that is now in Rendering Unconscious, which has just come out, and I'm so excited to see it. But I think it was actually really in that writing that I kind of found the position that I wanted to take as a psychoanalytic writer.
Nice.
Yeah,
I think that point is really important, and the point in the book is like, it's not actually about this man. It's so much more than the object. It's what this object person becomes for her, and her writing and her experience. And I think people need to understand that more in general, not only just with artists, but with others in their lives, because everything to me right now is like way too reactionary, and people really need to understand kind of these wider dynamics that are happening interpersonally with individuals, but also on like a larger cultural scale.
No, I mean, I forget which seminar it is. Maybe 3. I'm not sure. One of Lacan's seminars where he talks about, the kind of the psychoanalytic fantasy that we're supposed to get to, sort of ovulative love or something, that we're supposed to get to genital love, and we're supposed to get to some place where we treat the subject, we treat others as subjects, as subjects who aren't exchangeable, and we see another as a full subject in their own right, and this is what marks maybe cure for the patient, or like maturity, or whatever you want to call it. And he says this is absolute nonsense, and who's to say that being a subject, that being able to see someone as a subject, A, exists, and B, is any better? What is the we as analysts have with objects? And that it's actually, I think, a very similar point to the one that Chris Kraus is making, which is that the object does something. The object has a very important place in my subjective economy, and this is what's coming from it, and an enormous amount is coming from it. And you have to respect. You actually really have to give a lot of respect to how the object works, and to see it as a problem, that the object is acting precisely as an object that produces all sorts of things. Why on earth should that be a problem?
Yeah, I totally agree. Instead, see it for what it is and respect that process, instead of trying to make it into something else, some weird ideal that I don't know who came up with.
Right. And as though two subjects interacting is any better.
It's going to be better, yeah. And what about the other paper, Bellowing Presidents?
So that was for, several years ago, Unbehagen put on, after a sort of class series that was on Schreber, Freud's Case of Psychosis, President Schreber, and the Lacanian reading of the case. There was this amazing event that several Unbehagen members put on, that it was, kind of just an explosion of sort of creative and critical thinking, and it was very exciting. And so I wrote, forget exactly how the idea, I think again it was sort of transmitted. I think someone else kind of came up with the idea of writing about, and it was recently after the election, writing about something about these two presidents, President Trump and President Schreber. And I think what the event was kind of celebrating, or this is really similar to what we've been talking about, is the ways that language travels and the effects that writing and speaking have. And, if you read Schreber's memoir, that's what his concern is. And, Freud and Lacan then make a lot of that. Just reading the text itself, it's extremely compelling. His questions about how his words travel, how they're taken up, what this means, what it means to be a creature in language, at your mouth and go into someone else's ears, and then that makes someone else's mouth say something, and they might even say your name. And what does it mean that they're saying your name? And they've taken this, it's extremely moving. And I think he, as a writer, elaborated that set of concerns. It's extremely moving for readers, and it then goes on to produce, I think in the introduction to the edition that a lot of us were reading, it says that this is the most written about case in psychiatric literature, something like that. That this is a memoir and a document that gets people to write. It makes people very excited about speaking and writing, and people have a lot to say about it. And obviously people have a lot to say about Trump. And Trump is someone who gets people to speak and write and talk a lot about him. But I think, what I wanted to do in that piece was sort of contrast, sort of a creative, it was a creative more than a critical piece, but to indicate something about sort of Schreber's writing, which is just this absolutely lovely document, versus Trump, who gets you to speak about him, but there's something, much more vicious and narcissistic and terrible going on with that. But it was again this kind of around this moment of my trying to think through how to write as an analyst. That was a very productive endeavor, and then to be putting it in your book with all these other analysts writing sort of in a similar spirit, I think.
It's our really book. Exciting.
Yeah, our book. Yes. Our baby.
No, where I placed it was it's really great and refreshing to have, because the beginning of the books, it started out with a piece that Gabrielle Reisner wrote about Sabina Spielrein and her part in psychoanalytic history, and I, in the introduction, dedicated the book to her and all the analysts lost during World War II. So many of them were silenced and murdered. So it starts off with a piece about her. And then there's a piece about systemic racism and oppression by Tanya White Davis and Anu Cote, who are clinical health psychologists. And then Luce Delir has a piece about the Baltimore protests that turned into riots in 2015 after Freddie Gray was murdered. And then Chiara Bottici has a piece about Trump and MAGA that she presented at the SIP conference that year, right, the weekend after the election. Mm-hmm. And Manya Steinko has a piece about fake news, and then bellowing presidents, because we need a little relief after reading so many heavy pieces. Oh, and Alison Annunziata, how to say her name correctly, her piece about internet stalking and that violence is right up there, up front as well. So it's heavy, and then we have some bellowing presidents to kind of give us a little bit of pressure valve.
It's wonderful. How many contributions are there total? I mean, it's a lot.
There's about 50 people because of the poetry as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's about 50 people total. So that's why I say it's our book. I have read it about 5 times to edit it. So that was a lot. It was a lot of reading the book. It's 480 pages.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But it's great because it's all different pieces of kind of Unbehagen history. It's everybody involved is either in Unbehagen actively or has come from France or Italy or the UK to speak with Unbehagen at some point along the way, and then all the poets. Most of them are poets in New York. A lot of their pieces kind of reflect some of the heavier psychoanalytic theory pieces. And then I ended the book with a whole selection of poetry with Freud's idea in mind of every time I come to a new place in theory, a poet has been there before me. Right. So I ended with a selection of poetry. But it was really nice to put together, and it felt really coming full circle with Unbehagen, and like David Lichtenstein's first piece that he wrote about us like in 2012 is in there, and then Julie Fotheringham has her piece about like becoming an analyst, falling into analysis by accident and desire. So it's like really nice to have a whole range of like more formal academic pieces mixed with more personal pieces and more creative pieces and poetry. And like Chiara Bottici wrote a piece that's more creative, and her piece about MAGA. And then like Stephen Reisner wrote a really poignant like memoiric like musing. That's just 2 pages, but it's really packs a punch. So I can't wait for y'all to see it. I'll be getting them in your hands this week.
That's great. That's great. And I think bringing together creative and critical work is really important. And bringing in poets and putting psychoanalysis in conversation with artists and poets and people working in creative fields. It's a lot of. I'm on the editorial board of the Candidate Journal, and which is it's an online psychoanalytic publication that's been around for about 15 years, and it's run entirely by candidates in training, and it's a psychoanalytic journal, but the most recent editorial board, which has been doing it for the last 4 years or so. Julie is on it. Julie Fotheringham was the dancer. And, we have art historians on the board, and poets and artists, and we have found ourselves really interested in trying to bring together artists and psychoanalysts, and try to solicit more creative contributions, both from analysts and from those outside psychoanalysis, and that, I don't know, it feels really important. I mean, along the lines of what you're saying, of where analysis is alive in the humanities, and also that creative writing, art, literature have always been the grounds in which psychoanalysis, both what Freud was using to develop his theories and, and where it's sort of stayed fertile. And, if there's a question, I think there is how do, on the one hand, psychoanalysis is going to remain alive forever because the unconscious is not going to die. On the other hand, there does, or at least I feel there to be an enormous amount of urgency in terms of how do we transmit psychoanalysis into broader culture. I mean, there are obviously changes historically about where psychoanalysis is in the culture. And on the one hand, I think being on the margins in the way that we are now is actually a very good position to be in, and is maybe kind of necessary that psychoanalysis be on the margins of sort of dominant discourses. But for that very reason, I think there is an imperative to transmit something of psychoanalysis to other fields and into culture. And what I have been finding very compelling recently is to do it by bringing artists and psychoanalysts and writers and creative thinkers together, to the extent that we're always bordering on each other. I mean, if we're all working with the unconscious, then there has to be, there's always going to be a conversation that can be ongoing. And we just had, the Candidate Journal we just came out with our 8th issue, which actually will be advertising. I think we just put it up this morning online. And over the weekend we had a part, a issue release party on the subject of the issue is screens. So it's asking questions about screen life and sort of social media culture, but it also works in a lot of sort of visual art and questions about visuality and aesthetics generally. And the release party was sort of also a performance, and got a gallery space, and we got a bunch of artists to put up their work. And we had a few film installations and video art, and it was really great. It was really fun, and it felt like a kind of meeting of various bordering fields that felt really productive.
Yeah, it looked great. I saw some pictures of Julie and a couple of other people doing some dance, and Carl Jacobs and his film, and
yeah, there was a lot going on, and I think part also of this was part of what the Schreiber event was, which Evan Malader and I think Marie Hansen were sort of put it together with the understanding that there was a lot of enthusiasm for this one topic, and to try to sort of also promote desire. I think that was a lot of what was at stake, that this was going to be a very sort of polymorphous event with a lot of different moving parts and dancers, in one area of the building, and readings going on in various areas of the building, and music happening in various areas of the building. And I think a number of events that I've been involved in and that I've gone to since then have kind of followed that sort of model. Of sort of bringing together scholarly and critical and theoretical thinking with creative endeavors in a kind of celebratory atmosphere that has been really fun.
Yeah, because you and Anna Fishzon had the event, I guess it was after Schreiber. It was around that same time. Where was it? It was like in the north Manhattan, or almost to the Bronx. And Julie did performance there too, and we had readings.
Was it the Trump Dreams?
Yeah,
event?
the Dreams.
Yeah.
That's what it was. Yeah. It was so good.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really fun. That was, again, I think this was maybe Evan's idea that we picked up on to, it's funny with a lot of these events, you don't know who started it, kind of like something will start in one corner of the community and it'll get picked up somewhere else, and it kind of proliferates in this funny way where you lose your sense of who's responsible for what, which is, in and of itself very lovely. It's very nice. And, it's in certain ways, I think part of the ethic of that my writing is trying to capture, and that I'm sort of and what others are kind of interested in. But I think Evan sort of had some idea at some point after the election to collect people's dreams about Trump, which we picked up on the candidate, and we started collecting, sort of soliciting from Unbehagen and other analytic sort of venues, and then also outside our friends, or really anywhere we could get them, having people send in their dreams about the election and about Trump. And we got just a huge number of dreams. Because everyone was dreaming about Trump and super interested in this. Obviously, like everyone was kind of traumatized and had to process something, and sort of didn't know what to do with these dreams. And so I think even to sort of like provide a repository to put these things that we didn't know what to do with, and we didn't know how this was going to go or what life was going to look like after this. I think in and of itself that was a service. But so we sort of collected all of these dreams and got some space at Columbia that allowed us to put all these dreams together and project them and then perform them. And we worked it in with music and dance, and then we ended up putting it online on the candidate site.
Great! So it's up there. I have to link to that.
Yeah. It's on the site. We have these like dream portals where you can like click through and see text of the dreams interspersed with visual art, and they're super compelling. Some of them are just absolutely amazing dreams.
Yeah, I remember it was great because everybody was reading other people's dreams, but like a lot of the people who had entered dreams were there, but you weren't reading your own dream.
Right.
It was interesting. That whole period of time feels very fragmented. It's like we were here and then there, and it all feels like this giant kind of cut up dream sequence in itself.
Right, it was.
The year after.
Yeah. But you don't know what things are going to produce, this it was a horrible moment, but also produced, for me and for a lot of people I know, really produced an enormous amount, for better and worse. But
I talked to Todd Dean recently for the podcast, and we were talking about psychoanalysis, like this reminds me of what you were talking about before, with it being kind of on the fringes or the outskirts a bit, but and how the mainstream mental health paradigm and psychology is very like DSM and diagnosis and psychopharmaceuticals and this kind of thing. But he was talking about how instead of like accepting this kind of position on the outside, like why don't analysts do more to kind of change the discourse, you know? Mm-hmm. Like mm-hmm. Psychoanalysis was a prevalent discourse in mental health for a long time. Mm-hmm. And so like why don't we become more active to kind of change the discourse again instead of like being okay being on kind of on the outside. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't even thought about it that way so much, because it kind of felt just like inevitable that everybody was in this medical model. But it really does seem like a lot of different paradigms are being questioned and shifting. Like just today, several countries here have declared like a state of emergency about the climate, like Wales and England and Scotland. So things are starting to happen in a different way, it seems. And I think talking about psychoanalysis in mental health, but also getting it out through the arts and literature and more creative events is working. It's the way to go.
I think so too. I mean, I think it just has to be transmitted. Like I feel, you know, an enormous imperative for transmission. Whether or not, I think the question of the margin versus the center is maybe not even the question to be asking, or sort of not relevant, or at least needn't necessarily be on our minds. It just has to be transmitted, and then you see what happens. You know, I think that I do have trouble with the ways in which, you know, at least, you know, certain establishments to sort of position ourselves vis-a-vis CBT and say we're evidence-based too. Look, we have more evidence. We have all the evidence. It, you know, that has done a certain amount in their New York Times article now written about how psychoanalysis is also a really viable evidence-based form of therapy alongside CBT. I think in the long run, that's another kind of discourse. Whether that brings us to the center from the margins or not, you know, may not be the question. But I think we can't back down from that place, and sort of have to have faith that it'll travel. And, you know, I think that is what I'm seeing, and it feels like you're seeing too, that it does. It will travel.
It persists.
It persists.
Yeah, and I think that's why I find it so interesting to find out how everybody kind of got to psychoanalysis, because there's so many different paths that everyone has taken, mm-hmm. and none of them so far have been this kind of standard, I went to school and I decided I was going to do this and then did these like very specific steps to get there. Everybody seems to have come at it, you know, the way life goes.
The way life
meandering sometimes.
Well, and it also, you know, it says a lot about someone if they're an analyst. You know, I think we also, and that's kind of part, I think, of my position of writing from a kind of personal position, which in certain ways is like very embarrassing and feels very dangerous, kind of. But, you know, it's a weird thing to become an analyst. Like, not many people do it these days, and it's right. It isn't. If you can present it such that you've been following some kind of standard model of like, I decided to be a doctor and so I went through my training and blah, 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 then there's something that you're not saying about what made you an analyst. Like, the fact that you're an analyst already says an enormous amount about your history and your symptom and, you know, really personal stuff, which, you know, I think it's important to avow, at least in some way, not necessarily to get into the nitty gritty, but to find a way to speak and to find a position to speak from that at least implicitly avows something of the specificities of one's own history that brought you there is I think is kind of an imperative for analysts, and that was an imperative that I took on, I think, when writing, that something of this needs to really be made manifest. And I in my book, in the introduction, I use this moment in Roland Lover's discourse, where he, a lot of which is from Bauth was very influential for Maggie Nelson, and where he says, this is this book is a portrait of me. This is a portrait, but it's not a psychological portrait. It's a structural portrait. So, and what that means is sort of up for debate. But the way I took it was that that there's a way of speaking and writing personally and elaborates the specificities of the individual's life and their history, but is not a psychological portrait. There's something structural about it, that in getting really specific onto theory, onto discourse, and that it's a kind of complicated balancing point, but that for me, I think there's a wager there that's actually where theory can happen. And it's a position that I've also taken on. I mean, now that I'm teaching, it's the position that I've taken on as a teacher as well, that, and I often open my classes by asking students to, if they've had any dreams that they want to share, and we weave the dreams in and out of the class with the understanding that, when you share a dream, this is, obviously this is very personal material that you're sharing, but we can't get away from that, and we have to respect it and be careful about it. But that there is also a way of speaking personally in class and treating another person's personal speech in class that makes it not a psychological portrait, but a structural one. That we can do this rigorously and as a way of opening up onto theory rather than devolving into girlfriend talk or something like that. Which isn't necessarily bad either.
Yeah, I love that, and that's exactly what Freud did.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, and this is, I think this has to be remembered, that this is how psychoanalysis started. It started with Freud's self-analysis, which was in writing and was a form of address. It was written in letters and published.
Letters, yeah. Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Dr. Emma Lieber, a psychoanalyst in formation in New York. Dr. Lieber sees patients and is a part-time assistant professor of literary studies at the New School for Social Research. She is currently authoring a book called The Writing Cure and editing a volume, Queerness of Childhood, Essays from the Other Side of the Looking Glass, with Anna Fishzon. She's a member of the editorial board of the Candidate Journal, a psychoanalytic publication for early career clinicians, and of Das Unbehagen, a free association for psychoanalysis. For more, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. My website, drvanessasinclair.net, or renderingunconscious.org. We're both receiving a sublime, trans-dimensional expression Speculation about why this is can essentially only remain speculation. The most predominant argument is physiological, biological. The cyclic nature of the moon's presence and visibility has always been easy for humans to interpret. Rather, this same train of thought is also menstrual. Society and the place and materials cycle of women normally sticks to a regularity. The emergence, the life and art of have been easily performance and cultural progress, observable and transmittable very early on. Hence, an association was extended into culture. The ebb and tide of the sea also became attributed correctly to lunar forces and could easily have been extended association-wise to the ebb and flow of menstruation and its ties to invaluable new life. Towards the two men, Severine asks in a low voice, delineated by one. Eros is the Severine. Where did you find those two things? Love to you have done. Listen to me. The Mediterranean cultures worship the moon reverently through its goddesses. The Egyptian, to me, Isis, the Greek, Selene, the Roman, Diana, et al. Cross-fertilized at night over time in mythic minds, and other pagan pantheons over the world had already done that, and are still doing it. You to enter, Andromeda, all the cells in a body are waiting to be delivered yet again. A signature given to a friendly at our bidding. As Jung observed, a man who, too, I'm a king. Nerves and blood vessels, in fact, each with unique talents to offer. Attempt to produce, for my annual accultural, to be able to employ it. Neither can life in itself. States the ego is web of connective of the body, perception, heartbeat, the vitalized, the fascia for me, and the rat square with trees lining it. Disposability of heavy earth. Psychoanalysis is reckless and dangerous, a frenzy. And I are writing the first appearance. Our goal is not to be subsumed by the shadow. Is steel, is the largest organ in the body. Consciousness, moon goddess has always been. Transfer our loyalty to it. Indicative. Lipstick. Nose. Find in the word trivial, stemming from Roman goddess Trivia. And I see messages. Occasion to answer. Splendor. Unimportant and irrelevant. Another is the fact that the iconography of the powerful crescent moon associated with Luna and Diana later on became a symbol of chastity in Sexuality is a Force. Very sexy images. Discovered that his eyes were possess yourself, be hermaphrodite, are one, he explained. This, the sexualization of planets via gods and goddesses, is a language and process of necessity. If there is no myth circling around outer phenomena that are beyond our control, then despair quickly sets in. If there is no elevation or augmentation of banal human toil into divine shape, ditto, the student's merging of the masculine and feminine principles stemming from the immensely powerful cosmic forces and filtered through divine idealizations via myth is a safeguard for the human psyche. One that's presently and hopefully only temporarily lost. Psychoanalysis represents and not in the body, through a higher awareness of the human mind itself and of the necessity of an advanced open-minded human culture flourished during the now awakened and literature boomed, and quite often with inspired strings attached to antiquity's pantheonic health. Revitalized and everlasting symbol, clothed with your eyes as you behold.